In the spring of 1976, 14 men walked into an olive grove outside Corleone, a town in the interior of Sicily where the hills rise steep and dry under a sun that whitens the stone by midday. They were laborers, hired for the season to work the groves that belonged to families who had held that land for generations. The work was hard, the pay modest, and the arrangement understood without much need for paperwork or formality. You showed up, you worked, you were paid at the end of the week, and you asked no questions about whose trees you were tending or what else moved through those hills after dark. That was how it had always been, and that was how it was expected to remain. Corleone in those years was not the place that cinema would later make famous. It was a town of narrow streets and low buildings, of courtyards where women hung laundry on lines strung between balconies, where men sat outside cafes in the early evening and spoke in low voices about things that were no one else's concern. The town sat on a ridge, surrounded by farmland and olive groves that stretched for miles in every direction, and the roads that led in and out were few and winding. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where families had lived for centuries, where your name carried weight or it carried nothing, and where silence was not just preferred, but required. The 14 men who disappeared that spring were not from Corleone itself. Most had come from villages farther south, from places along the coast or deeper inland where work was scarce, and the promise of seasonal employment was enough to make a man leave home for a few months. They arrived in early March, just as the weather was turning and the olive trees were beginning to show new growth. They were housed in a stone building near the grove, a structure that had once been used for storage and had been converted into rough sleeping quarters. There were no comforts, just cots and a table and a stove that worked when the wind was right. The men kept to themselves, ate their meals together, and each morning walked the short distance to the grove to begin the day's work. The arrangement had been made through intermediaries, men who needed laborers, and who knew other men who needed work. It was not unusual. In rural Sicily, employment often moved through these channels, through networks of family and acquaintance that operated outside any formal structure. You did not apply for a job in the way that might happen in a city. You knew someone, or someone knew you, and word was passed along, and if you were deemed acceptable, you were told where to go and when. The 14 men who came to work the grove had been vouched for by someone, though by whom exactly was never entirely clear. They were young, most of them, in their 20s or early 30s, and they were grateful for the work. For the first few weeks, everything proceeded as it should. The men worked from early morning until late afternoon, pruning the older trees, clearing brush, repairing the low stone walls that divided the property. They were paid each Saturday, a small envelope of cash handed over by a man who came up from the town in a dark car, who spoke only a few words and then drove away again. The laborers spent their evenings at the stone house cooking simple meals, playing cards, occasionally walking into Corleone to buy cigarettes or bread. They kept to themselves, which was expected. They did not socialize with the locals, did not ask questions, did not make themselves known. That was the arrangement. But in early April, something changed. A group of men arrived at the grove. One afternoon, men who were not from Corleone and who did not have the look of farmers or landowners. They drove up in 2 cars parked at the edge of the property and spent an hour walking through the trees, examining the land, speaking among themselves. The laborers watched from a distance, uncertain whether they should continue working or stop. One of the visitors, a man in a light jacket and dark trousers, approached the laborers and asked them questions. He wanted to know who owned the grove, who had hired them, how long they had been working there, whether they had seen anything unusual. The questions were asked in a casual tone, as if they were of no great importance, but the laborers understood immediately that this was not a casual conversation. They answered cautiously, giving only the information that seemed safe to give. They did not know who owned the grove, they said. They had been hired through a contact in their village, and they had been told only to show up and work. They had seen nothing unusual. They kept their heads down and did their jobs. The man in the light jacket nodded, made a few notes in a small book, and then returned to his companions. The group spent another 20 minutes walking the property, and then they got back into their cars and drove away. The laborers returned to their work, but the ease that had characterized the previous weeks was gone. They spoke among themselves that evening, trying to understand who the visitors had been and what they had wanted. Some thought they might have been government inspectors, checking for tax compliance or land use violations. Others thought they might have been surveyors preparing for some kind of development. A few said nothing, but their faces carried a worry that needed no words. 2 days later, another group arrived. This time the men who came were local. They were known in Corleone, though their names were spoken carefully and never in the wrong company. They arrived in the early evening just as the laborers were finishing their work for the day. There were 4 of them, and they did not ask questions. They told the laborers to gather their things and come with them. The laborers hesitated, uncertain whether this was an order or a request, but the tone left no room for confusion. They were to come, and they were to come now. One of the laborers, a man named Salvatore, asked where they were being taken. He was told it was not his concern. Another asked whether they had done something wrong. He was told to be quiet. The laborers were driven in 2 vehicles back toward Corleone, but they did not enter the town. Instead, they were taken to a farmhouse several kilometers to the east, a place surrounded by fields and accessible only by a dirt road that turned off the main route and wound through scrub and low trees. The farmhouse was old, its walls thick and its windows small and high. Inside, the rooms were bare, with only a few chairs and a table. The laborers were told to sit and wait. They waited for over an hour, saying little to one another, the weight of the situation settling over them like the dust that drifted through the open door. Eventually, 2 men entered the room, men who carried themselves with an authority that did not need to be explained. They stood at the front of the room and looked at the laborers in silence for a long moment. Then one of them spoke. He asked, in a voice that was calm and almost polite, whether any of them had spoken to the visitors who had come to the grove 2 days earlier. The laborers exchanged glances, and several of them nodded. Yes, they said they had been asked questions, and they had answered. The man asked what questions had been asked, and what answers had been given. The laborers recounted the conversation as best they could remember it. They had said they did not know who owned the grove. They had said they had been hired through a contact. They had said they had seen nothing unusual. The man listened without expression, and when they had finished, he asked whether any of them had mentioned names. The laborers said no, they had not mentioned any names, because they did not know any names to mention. The man seemed to consider this. Then he asked whether any of them had been told when they were hired that they were not to speak to anyone about the work they were doing or the place where they were working. The laborers hesitated. They had not been told this explicitly, but they had understood it. It was an understanding that came with the territory, a rule that did not need to be spoken. But now, in this room, with these men standing before them, the absence of an explicit warning seemed suddenly significant. One of the laborers, a man named Giuseppe, said quietly that they had assumed they were not supposed to talk about their work, but that no one had told them directly. The man at the front of the room nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. What followed was a conversation that lasted another hour. Though conversation may not be the right word, it was more a series of statements delivered by the 2 men, statements that the laborers were expected to hear and understand. They were told that the grove they had been working belonged to people who valued their privacy. They were told that the visitors who had come asking questions were not friends of those people. They were told that speaking to outsiders even in response to direct questions, even with the best intentions, was a form of disrespect that could not be tolerated. They were told that the land they had been tending was part of a larger network of properties and interests that extended far beyond what they could see or understand, and that their role was to work, not to observe, and certainly not to speak. They were told that this was not a threat, but a clarification. They were told that they would be allowed to return to their work, but that they would not be allowed to make this mistake again. The laborers were driven back to the stone house near the grove that night, and they returned to their work the following morning. But the atmosphere had changed entirely. Where before there had been a kind of routine, a predictable rhythm of labor and rest, there was now a silence that felt deliberate and heavy. The men spoke to one another only when necessary, and even then in voices barely above a whisper. They worked with their heads down, not looking up when vehicles passed on the road, not acknowledging anyone who came near the property. They ate their meals quickly and went to bed early, as if hoping that invisibility might offer some protection. For a week, nothing happened. The work continued. The envelopes of cash were delivered on Saturday as usual, and the days passed without incident. But the laborers could feel the change in the air, could sense that they were being watched even when no one was visible. Some of them began to talk quietly about leaving, about returning to their villages and finding other work. But they had been paid for the month in advance, and leaving early would mean forfeiting that money, which for most of them was more than they could afford to lose. And there was another concern, one that no one wanted to speak aloud, but that they all understood. Leaving now after what had happened, after what had been said, might be seen as another form of disrespect, another violation of the unwritten rules that governed this place, and so they stayed. On a Thursday evening in late April, the laborers were working in the far section of the grove, an area that sloped down toward a dry creek bed and was surrounded by thicker brush. They had been clearing dead branches and stacking them for burning, work that was slow and tedious. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ground, and they were preparing to finish for the day when they heard the sound of vehicles approaching. 2 trucks came up the dirt track that led into the grove, moving slowly, their engines rumbling in the stillness. The laborers stopped working and turned to watch. The trucks parked at the edge of the clearing, and several men got out. The laborers recognized some of them from the farmhouse, from the night they had been taken to hear the clarification. The men from the trucks did not speak. They simply gestured for the laborers to gather their tools and come with them. There was no explanation, no indication of where they were going or why. The laborers hesitated, looking at one another, and then slowly began to move toward the trucks. One of them, a young man named Marco, asked what was happening. He was told to be quiet and get in the truck. Another asked whether they had done something wrong. He received no answer. The laborers climbed into the backs of the trucks, sitting on the metal beds, their tools still in their hands. The trucks started moving, driving not back toward the stone house or toward Corleone, but in the opposite direction, deeper into the hills. The road they took was rough and narrow, barely wide enough for the trucks to pass. It wound upward through terrain that grew increasingly remote, past abandoned farmhouses and overgrown fields, past stands of trees that had not been tended in years. The light was fading quickly, and the air was growing cool. The laborers sat in silence, gripping the sides of the truck beds as the vehicles bounced over ruts and stones. After perhaps 30 minutes, the trucks turned off the road entirely and began to follow a track that was barely visible, a path that seemed to lead nowhere. The brush grew thicker, and the trees closed in on either side, and then, without warning, the trucks stopped. The men who had been driving and riding in the cabs got out and opened the tailgates. They told the laborers to get down. The laborers climbed out, standing in a loose group in the near darkness, surrounded by trees and brush and the vast silence of the hills. One of the men from the trucks, A man they had not seen before stepped forward and looked at them for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and even. He said that there had been another visit to the grove that afternoon, another group of outsiders asking questions. He said that someone had told these outsiders something, some piece of information that should not have been shared. He said that this had created a problem that required a solution. The laborers began to protest, to say that they had not spoken to anyone, that they had followed every instruction, that they had done nothing wrong. But their words seemed to fall into a void. The man raised his hand, and the talking stopped. He said that it did not matter who had spoken, because the problem was not just one person, it was the group. The group had been a risk from the beginning, and now that risk had become real. He said that the people who owned the grove, who owned many groves and many other things, had decided that the risk could not be allowed to continue. He said that this was not personal, it was simply necessary. What happened next was done without ceremony or hesitation. The laborers were separated, taken in small groups, deeper into the brush. The men who took them carried tools from the trucks, shovels and other implements that suggested preparation. The laborers understood then what was going to happen, and some of them tried to run. But the brush was thick, and the darkness was nearly complete. And there was nowhere to run to, no road that led back to safety, no lights in the distance that might offer refuge. One by one, they were removed from the situation in which they had found themselves. It was done quietly, efficiently, without anger or cruelty, but also without mercy. It was a matter of necessity, as the man had said, a solution to a problem that the laborers themselves had not fully understood. They represented by the time the first light of morning touched the hills, the grove was empty. The stone house where the laborers had stayed was cleaned out, the cots removed, the belongings that had been left behind taken away. The tools they had used were gathered and disposed of. The envelopes that would have been delivered the following Saturday were never prepared. In Corleone, no one spoke of what had happened. The families who might have been waiting for the laborers to return received no word, no explanation. In the villages where the men had come from, there were questions, but questions that were asked carefully, and that received no answers. Some families made inquiries with local authorities, but those inquiries led nowhere. The men had gone to work in the interior, and then they had simply disappeared. It was not the first time such a thing had happened, and it would not be the last. In the months that followed, the olive grove continued to be tended, but by different workers, men who were brought in from elsewhere and who asked no questions and spoke to no one. The property changed hands, or appeared to change hands, though the true ownership remained as obscure as it had always been. The visitors who had come in early April, the outsiders who had asked questions, completed their business and left the area. Whether they found what they were looking for, or whether their questions had been answered, was never made clear. The farmhouse where the laborers had been taken for their clarification returned to its usual quiet, and the road that led into the hills where the trucks had gone that night was used only rarely by people who knew where it led and why it was there. Years later, when researchers and journalists began to look more closely at the patterns of disappearances in rural Sicily during the 1970s, the case of the 14 laborers was noted but never fully resolved. There were records of the men having traveled to Corleone, employment contracts that had been filed with local offices, testimony from family members who had received letters in the early weeks of their work. But after late April, there was nothing. No bodies were ever found. No witnesses came forward. The men who might have known what happened had no reason to speak, and the structures that might have compelled them to speak had no authority in that place. The case was filed away, one among many, another entry in the long catalogue of silence that characterized that time in that region. The grove itself remained productive for many years, the olive trees continuing to bear fruit, the land continuing to generate revenue. The families who controlled it expanded their holdings, diversifying into other crops, other businesses, other regions. The network of properties and interests that the laborers had been told about, the network they had not been meant to see or understand, continued to function as it always had, through channels that were known only to those who needed to know them. The town of Corleone grew and changed. New generations arrived, old ones passed away, and the events of that spring became a story that was told quietly, if it was told at all, a story that served as a reminder of what could happen when the rules were not followed, when silence was not maintained, when outsiders were allowed to see too much. In the villages where the 14 men had come from, their families waited for news that never came. Some held out hope for years, believing that perhaps their sons or brothers or husbands had simply moved on, had found work elsewhere, had chosen for reasons of their own not to return. Others understood more quickly that hope was not useful, that the absence was permanent, that the silence was final. They held funerals without bodies, services where the names of the missing were spoken and then not spoken again. They learned, as many had learned before them, that some questions could not be asked, that some losses could not be mourned publicly, that the machinery of power that operated in the interior of Sicily did not answer to grief or law or reason. The land where the laborers were removed from the problem they represented returned to its natural state over time. The brush grew thicker, the trees reclaimed the paths, and the earth absorbed what it had been given. There were no markers, no memorials, no acknowledgement that 14 lives had ended there on a spring night in 1976. The hills continued their ancient silence. The wind moved through the olive groves, and the rhythm of the seasons carried on as it always had. The place remembered nothing, because the place had been designed to forget, because forgetting was its function, because memory was a luxury that could not be afforded in a landscape where survival depended on knowing when to look away. In the archives of the regional government, in the files of investigators who worked on organized crime cases in the decades that followed, the names of the 14 laborers appear occasionally, fragments of a larger pattern that researchers have tried to piece together. There are theories about what happened, educated guesses based on the known practices of the groups that controlled rural Sicily in that era, analyses of the economics of land and labor and the mechanisms by which power was maintained. But theories are not answers, and patterns are not justice. And the families who lost their loved ones that spring learned long ago that documentation is not the same as resolution. The story of the olive grove and the 14 men who worked there and then did not is one of many such stories from that time and that place. It is not unique in its details or its outcome. What makes it worth recounting is not its brutality, which was routine, or its injustice, which was systemic, but rather the way it illustrates the logic of a world where silence was currency, where questions were danger, where the boundary between employment and elimination could be crossed without warning and without appeal. It is a story about the machinery of control in a place where control was absolute, where the structures of power operated beneath the surface of daily life, invisible until the moment they were needed, and then sudden and final. The 14 men who walked into that olive grove in March of 1976 were not heroes or criminals or activists. They were workers looking for wages, men trying to support their families, individuals who found themselves in the wrong place at a moment when the wrong place became fatal. They made no great error, committed no significant transgression. They simply answered questions when questions were asked, and in doing so, they became evidence of something that was not supposed to be seen. And so they were made to disappear, not in a frenzy of violence or in a moment of passion, but as a practical matter, a problem solved, a risk eliminated. The men who carried out the elimination were not monsters. They were functionaries, employees of a system that valued order above all else, that understood survival as a matter of maintaining boundaries and enforcing rules that everyone knew but no one could speak. In the years since, the region has changed in many ways. The grip of the organizations that controlled the land and the labor has weakened, though not disappeared. The economy has shifted, tourism has arrived. The young people have left for the cities, and the old ways have given ground to new ones. But the memory of those years, the memory of the silences and the disappearances and the unwritten rules, remains present in the collective consciousness of the communities that lived through them. It is a memory that is not often spoken aloud, but that shapes behavior and expectations nonetheless. A memory that reminds people that some forms of power do not announce themselves, that some dangers do not come with warnings, that some prices are paid long after the moment of transgression has passed. The olive grove still stands, though it is no longer worked as intensively as it once was. The trees are older now, gnarled and thick-trunked, their branches heavy with the weight of decades. The stone house where the laborers stayed has been torn down, replaced by a newer structure that serves a different purpose. The road that leads into the hills, the road the trucks took that night, is rarely traveled now, overgrown in places, washed out in others. The land has returned to a kind of peace, if peace is the right word for a place that carries such a history. The wind still moves through the branches, the sun still whitens, they always have, but underneath the surface, underneath the appearance of normalcy and continuity, the past remains present, not as memory exactly, but as a kind of knowledge, a collective understanding of what happened and why it happened and what it meant. For the families of the 14 men, there has been no closure, no moment of recognition or restitution. Their loved ones are not officially listed as victims of organized crime, because there was never enough evidence to make that designation formal. They are simply missing persons, names in a file, cases that remain open in theory, but inactive in practice. Some families have given up asking questions, have accepted the absence as a permanent condition of their lives. Others have continued to search, to write letters, to appeal to authorities, to hold on to the hope that someday, somehow, there will be an answer. But the years have passed, and the likelihood of resolution has faded, and what remains is grief and anger and the quiet certainty that justice, in this case, will not arrive. The story of the Sicilian olive grove silence of 1976 is not a story with a clear moral or a satisfying ending. It is a story about the machinery of power in a particular place and a particular time, about the ways that human lives become expendable when they conflict with the interest of those who hold authority, about the silence that descends when speaking becomes too dangerous, about the landscape that absorbs tragedy without comment or change. It is a story that reminds us that history is not always loud, that violence is not always spectacular, that sometimes the most significant events are the ones that happen quietly, in remote places, witnessed by no one, recorded by no one, remembered only by those who cannot forget. The 14 men who disappeared into the hills that spring night in 1976 left behind families, communities, lives that were permanently altered by their absence. They were fathers and sons and brothers, men with names and histories and futures that were erased in a matter of hours. They became, in the end, simply numbers in a ledger of violence, casualties of a system that valued order over life, silence over truth, power over humanity. Their story is one of thousands from that era, from that region, stories that collectively paint a picture of a society organized around principles that most of the world would find intolerable, but that were, for those who lived within them, simply the way things were. In the decades since, Italy has undertaken a long and difficult reckoning with the legacy of organized crime, with the power structures that enabled it, with the silences that protected it. There have been trials and investigations, revelations and reforms, moments of accountability that would have been unthinkable in 1976. But the work is far from complete, and the mechanisms that allowed 14 men to disappear without consequence are still present in many forms, still operative in many contexts. The story of the olive grove is not just history, it is a warning, a reminder that the capacity for this kind of violence, this kind of silence, this kind of erasure, does not disappear simply because time passes or societies change. It remains latent, waiting for the conditions that allow it to emerge again, waiting for the moment when power decides that elimination is necessary and silence is required. The land remembers nothing, but the people remember, or try to remember, or are told to remember by those who know that forgetting is its own form of complicity. The olive grove continues to produce its fruit, the trees continue their slow growth, and the hills continue their watch over the valleys below. But the silence that descended in 1976 has never been fully broken, and the 14 men who walked into those groves and never walked out remain present in that silence, not as voices but as absences, not as stories but as gaps in the story, not as answers but as questions that will not, perhaps cannot, ever be fully addressed. And that is how the story ends, not with resolution, but with continuation, not with justice, but with memory, not with closure, but with the persistent, uncomfortable awareness that some things, once done, cannot be undone, and some silences, once established, cannot be undone, and some silences, once established, cannot be undone, and some silences, once established, is so uncomfortably. Awareness to some silence, once established as of one, become permanent features of the landscape they were designed to protect.